With De'Aaron Fox seemingly on his way out of Sacramento, well, it got me thinking about the past. You see, we here in the city are kind of used to this sort of thing. Star players really do not stick around. Also, for the sake of this video, I'm just arbitrarily determining what a star player means to Sacramento. I don't really think locals will disagree with me, although if you're from out of town, you might not fully understand why Walt Williams is a star player. But again, in this video, someone like Chris Webber, obviously star player. Harrison Barnes and Corliss Williamson? Not so much. Aging Mike Bibby? I'll allow it. And as for Nik Stauskas, well, that trade is going to get its own video down the road. Without further ado, starting with the most recent and going backwards in time, here's what happened every time the Sacramento Kings have traded a star player. We start with Tyreke Haliburton, who was swapped along with Buddy Hield and some other stuff for Domantas Sabonis and some other stuff. I mean, really, this trade has always boiled down to Haliburton for Sabonis. The most annoying part of De'Aaron Fox's whole trade, not request, is that the Kings previously made this deal not too long ago. We had a similar younger guard in Haliburton who genuinely seemed to like Sacramento, who wanted to be here, who wanted to revive the franchise's fortunes. If Fox leaves, the Haliburton deal in turn becomes an absolute disaster, more so than it may already have been, given the fact Haliburton has led his team to an Eastern Conference Finals, and we here in Sacramento are still awaiting a single playoff series victory. The Kings went all in on a guy who now is going to jump ship a few seasons later. That is just bad basketball front office maneuvering. It's also creating something what you can sort of refer to as the Domantas Sabonis problem. Look, he's a great player, stand-up dude, yet he's just such an odd fit. He's a hard person, a hard player to build a team around. You have limits as to what you can do with your team. You really have to go all in on Sabonis' skill set, and there are limitations there. Who would trade for Sabonis? Who is going all in on his skill set? His suitors are extremely limited, especially if the Kings are now going in this full rebuild. Even if what we see today is Haliburton's ceiling, a fringe all-star, fringe all-NBA caliber player, that's pretty damn good. And you wouldn't have to worry about him pulling out the Rich Paul card anytime. Yet all of this does come with the caveat of hindsight. I don't think anyone foresaw Haliburton becoming as good as he did. And no one really foresaw Fox wanting to be traded a few years down the road. Yet, if he does leave Sacramento, if De'Aaron Fox does leave town, this trade is going to look a hell of a lot worse. Next up, we have, let's just call it what it was, DeMarcus Cousins for Buddy Hield in a first-round draft pick. Omri Casspe's involved, Tyreke Evans' reunion was involved, but yeah, this really boils down to DeMarcus Cousins, and quite frankly, Buddy Hield, because that's who Vivek Ranadive coveted more than any other player in the NBA at this time. When you look back at the deal, it's kind of been a wash for both franchises. However, it really wasn't when it was made. DeMarcus Cousins, the minute he shows up to New Orleans in the Smoothie King Center, he plays like a Hall of Famer. He goes on a legendary tear, including dropping 40 points on the Kings twice. Then he does tear his Achilles and was never really the same player after that. Meanwhile, Buddy Hield, or Vivek Ranadive's Steph Curry, was exactly who most people thought he was. I will never understand Ranadive's obsession with Buddy Buckets, who, again, solid player, can play a role in the NBA, but wasn't this all-star caliber player that Vivek Ranadive thought he would turn into. But pouring salt into the wound of trading away DeMarcus Cousins was the fact the Kings had to take back Tyreke Evans, but more on him in due course. The first-round draft pick would actually fall into the lottery, but Sacramento's front office opted to trade down from the 10th pick, watching Bam Adebayo and Donovan Mitchell be taken before they were on the clock again. The 15th and 20 selections would turn into Justin Jackson and Harry Giles, two absolute nothing players who are no longer with the Kings, meaning DeMarcus Cousins was traded away for basically nothing. The Isaiah Thomas sign-in trade in the summer of 2014 is one of those transactions I think all Kings fans would just like to forget. The short-statured guard was an absolute revelation for the Kings after being taken with the last pick in the 2011 NBA draft.
What kind of guy is Isaiah Thomas? He's quick, fiery, and determined.
And I'm a pizza guy.
I mean, he was dead wrong about the pizza guys.
Then get the pizza guys.
comically overpriced and not all of that good. Sorry, not sorry. But yeah, on the court, Isaiah Thomas was just an absolute blast to watch on a team that didn't have a lot of watchable players. For whatever reason, though, the front office at the time did not want to pay Isaiah Thomas, preferring the likes of Ben McLemore, Nik Stauskas, Ray McCollum, and Darren Collison. Worse yet, the Kings sign and trade Thomas for nothing in return. Alex Oriaki never plays for the Kings, or in the NBA for that matter. The trade exception just sort of peters out. I think the Kings used it, but I couldn't tell you who they used it on because it wasn't anyone worthwhile. The Suns then flipped Thomas midway through his first season in Phoenix for a first-round pick in Marcus Thornton. Collison, for his part, a solid role player for Sacramento during the mid-2010s, but McLemore, Stauskas, McCollum just absolutely contributed nothing, weren't really building blocks that the team, for whatever reason, thought they were. I will never, ever understand why the Kings front office just wouldn't give the pizza guy a long-term deal. Man, we're 3 trades in, and I'm already bummed out. This is a complicated 3-team trade. It's really a sign and trade for Tyreke Evans. He goes to New Orleans, and of all of the players, Sacramento would get Greivis Vasquez back. Evans is one of those guys who really started off hot. First overall pick in 2009, wins Rookie of the Year with Sacramento, a lot of hype, and then he stagnates. I mean, you could even argue he regressed over the next 3 seasons after winning Rookie of the Year. Now, in his defense, these are peak dysfunction years for the Kings. The Maloof brothers don't have any money. There are all these relocation rumors. I mean, it is just full-on substitute teacher mode in Sacramento around this time, which does kind of explain why Evans never developed into the guy most fans thought he would become. Unlike Isaiah Thomas a year later, when Evans is part of a sign-and-trade, there weren't really many folks in town sad to see him leave. And unlike the Thomas trade, the Kings actually received a useful piece back in return as part of the sign and trade deal, getting Vasquez, who would later be shipped out to Toronto in return for poor old Rudy Gay. Basically, this trade boils down to Kevin Martin for Carl Landry. Now, it becomes a big ol' smudge when the Knicks glom on in order to acquire Tracy McGrady's expiring deal because they think they're signing LeBron and Chris Bosh and Dwayne Wade in that free agent class. Lol. But the Rockets and Kings actually had an agreement in place before the Knicks even entered the fray, and it was really centered around the Rockets getting Kevin Martin and the Kings getting Carl Landry with McGrady's expiring deal in there. As for the trade, let's just start by saying this. Kevin Martin is one of the most underrated players out there. Yeah, I know he was oft injured, and that's obviously a problem, but when he was healthy, Kevin Martin was one of the most eloquent scorers the NBA ever saw. Meanwhile, Carl Landry had sort of become this hotshot 6th Man of the Year candidate for Houston, a power forward who could come in and do a couple of different things off the bench, which of course meant the Sacramento Kings immediately decided to start him when he showed up to town, totally ignoring what Carl Landry was really good at in the NBA. The results were unsurprisingly meh, and Landry would be traded a year later for Marcus Thornton, who was a scorer, but one that wasn't nearly as good as Kevin Martin. These are the kind of progressive downgrade moves that see your NBA franchise fail to win a playoff series for like a billion years in a row. Brad Miller and John Salmons were effective players. Miller was getting up there in age. Salmons had limitations as a scorer, but still useful. So the Kings shipped him out for 4 guys who contributed almost nothing. I think the best way to describe Miller at this point in time was effective. He was just an effective center, but not quite the player he once was. This trade, by the way, it just feels like the equivalent of some swap meet deal. Like, I have this baseball mitt with no webbing. You have this mini fridge door without the rest of the mini fridge. Let's make a deal. Drew Gooden plays a game for the Kings before being waived. Nocioni hangs around but does nothing of note in Sacramento. Simmons is bench fodder, and Ruffin is swapped for Ike Diago the very same day. Miller and Salmons were solid for Chicago while they were there, but neither are around when the Bulls go on their Eastern Conference Finals run 2 seasons later. You may know him today as Metta Sandiford-Artest. He was known as Ron Artest, Metta World Peace. He went by lots of different names as he is wont to do. This deal, though, seeing him go from Sacramento to Houston was really just kind of a sucker punch. Look, he was seemingly destined to be traded during the summer of 2008. You know, Sacramento is on the slow boat to nowhere at this point. Having a guy like World Peace or Artest in his prime, ready to contribute to a team that's in the playoffs, pushing for a championship. It was just an inevitability. While the Knicks and Lakers were at various times favorites to swing a deal for the swingman, it would be the Houston Rockets and former Kings coach Rick Adelman that landed Artest. So, on paper, I think you look at Sacramento's return on the trade and go like, okay, they did pretty well for themselves. Dante Green was a first-round pick in that year's NBA draft, a late first-round pick. They also got a future first-rounder in a reunion with Bobby Jackson, which was just kind of in there for salary purposes. The 2009 first-rounder, though, turned into Omri Caspi, a good role player, but on a team with no stars, you don't really need role players. Meanwhile, Dante Green spends like 4 seasons in Sacramento serving as the equivalent of a human white flag. Seriously, if Dante Green was entering the game for the Kings while he was with the team, it was basically a sign they had totally given up, like they were punting on this game and that there was no way in hell they were coming back to win. Much like the Brad Miller trade, Mike Bibby was also traded from Sacramento for a bunch of random spare parts that had little use to Sacramento. Now, one thing about Bibby I don't think we talk about enough was his usage in Sacramento. Apart from some injury issues in the 02-03 season, he pretty much played every game and at least 35 minutes a night. He's logged a ton of miles by the time he's 29. And I mean, honestly, he was okay with Atlanta, but it's not like they received peak Mike Bibby. That being said, you would hope for a little more than just 4 dudes in return for a starting caliber point guard. And Bibby was still a starting caliber point guard even at this time. I mean, really, the only highlight of the trade package was a weird reunion with Anthony Johnson, who returned to the Kings 10 years after first playing for the franchise, which meant he missed the only time the team was any good. One of the simplest trades on this list, Peja Stojaković for Ron Artest. You know, to this day, Stojaković still very much a beloved figure in Sacramento. Ron Artest at this time was just this head case. You have malice at the palace. He demanded a trade a while before. He was just kind of seen as like this almost untouchable figure by a lot of teams, given how difficult it was perceived he was to work with. That is actually something that bears out in this trade. What's just dragged on and on forever. Like everybody knew the Kings and Pacers were talking Stojaković for Artest trade. Like it was like the worst kept secret in the league. Yet it just like it went on for weeks because no one knew like would Artest report to Sacramento? Did he want to go to Sacramento? Like what the deal was. And both players have gone on record to admit that this was the case. In fact, right as the trade is about to be finally completed, Artest's agent comes out and says Ron Artest didn't want to be traded to Sacramento 2 weeks ago and he didn't want to be traded to Sacramento now. Stojaković was equally as unhappy. I mean, he heard all of these rumors, but no one from the front office was actually talking with him, and he wouldn't find out he was traded until he learned from the deal happening on television. Yet, when the dust settled, Artest shows up to Sacramento, and honestly, he sort of single-handedly saved the Kings season in 05-06. The team goes 14-5 after the trade. I mean, they still get bounced in the first round of the playoffs by the Spurs, but really, Artest just had this galvanizing effect on the team that year. Stojaković, meanwhile, was a pending free agent after the season, so he doesn't re-up with Indiana. He ends up in New Orleans, meaning the Kings really didn't lose anything here. I mean, there was, of course, the chance they could have re-signed Stojaković, but getting Artest seemed like a better deal, at least in hindsight. Things probably work out had the Kings kept on Adelman as head coach, a man who just really vibed with Artest. Like, it's weird, but Artest and Adelman had a really good relationship. Instead, the Maloof show Adelman the door. Artest just gets super weird, like he's calling into the radio stations all the time. Like, it's not a great scene, and things just devolve entirely under the Maloofs around this time. Bobby Jackson and Greg Ostertag for Bonzi Wells. A lot of players you probably forgot about, at least as it relates to the Kings, especially Greg Ostertag, Kings great allegedly. Anyway, you're probably thinking, if you're not from Sacramento, well, Bobby Jackson, he's not a star. But let me tell you, folks, Bobby Jackson is a legit star in Sacramento. Dude is a legend, but this deal is a total head scratcher. At the time, it didn't make sense, and now it probably makes even less sense. So the Kings sign Ronnie Price and they trade for Jason Hart during the offseason and hope one of those two guys can replace Jackson. Now, Action Jackson had issues staying healthy during his time in Sacramento, yet I'd argue 50 games of him would have been better than 150 games of Hart and Price combined. Backup point guard was a sore spot for the Kings all season that year, by the way. The team ends up running Mike Bibby just into the dirt. Bibby averages 38.5 minutes per night and plays all 82 games. When Chris Webber was traded from Sacramento to the Philadelphia 76ers, it was a sad day. He was also accompanied by a young Matt Barnes and Michael Bradley. The Kings get a reunion with Corliss Williamson. As for whatever reason, the team, as you'll see as we continue, the Kings love trading for players they once had, but this return, man, it sucked. In fact, many of you are probably looking at what the Kings got for Webber, and you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, it's a pretty terrible return. You're not wrong. I mean, Kenny Thomas was the jewel of this trade, and it's Kenny freaking Thomas. Yet there are quite a few extenuating circumstances around the Webber transaction that do need to be addressed here. C-Web blows out his knee in the 2003 playoffs, has microfracture surgery, and would miss most of the 03-04 campaign. You also have the fact that he's still dealing with the fallout from the Michigan scandal. I mean, that's hanging over his head throughout this time. He can't even come back when he's healthy. He has to serve a 3-game NBA-imposed suspension for his role in the whole Michigan fiasco. The Kings, having won 55 games without the power forward, sort of come to realize they don't necessarily need him to succeed. They don't need him to win games. And given his outsized contract, there had slowly become the realization that Webber was very much expendable in Sacramento. In fact, moving him on would allow the team to better utilize the salary cap, especially since Webber had 2 years on his huge deal. Yet all that aside, it does feel like the Kings could have done a little better here. I mean, Kenny Thomas, Corliss Williamson for Chris Webber. And again, Chris Webber coming off an injury wasn't quite the player he once was, but was still a really good power forward. So yeah, I understand why the Kings made this trade, but it wasn't great. Doug Christie to the Orlando Magic for the aforementioned Michael Bradley and Cuttino Mobley. Look, at this point in his career, Doug Christie is really struggling. He's lost a step. He's still a good defender, but offensively, he's kind of gumming up the works for the Kings, and they're just not getting the contributions they once got from Christie. Meanwhile, Mobley was a free agent after the season and wasn't sticking around Orlando. He also showed no interest with signing Sacramento long-term, so this was really just a rental. The Kings kind of wanted to see if Mobley could push them over the top in the postseason, and really anything would have been an upgrade on Christie at this point in time. This is a fairly convoluted 3-team trade, but here's what you need to know from Sacramento's perspective. They get Brad Miller from Indiana, who's doing the signing and trading. They send Scott Pollard to the Pacers, and Hedo Turkoglu ends up in San Antonio. This was a deal that was made due in part to the Webber injury. He's not going to play for most of the 2003-04 season. You have Vlade Divac at center, but he's really starting to get up there in age. The Kings sort of understood we need some size. We need someone in the middle who can anchor the team moving forward. Enter Brad Miller, who was a free agent, and Indiana was really looking to sign and trade him. The Pacers couldn't afford him given luxury tax concerns, and they're needing to extend Jermaine O'Neal. San Antonio ends up with Hedo Turkoglu as sort of facilitating this deal. They also took Ron Mercer from the Pacers because the Pacers wanted to protect their cap. The Kings needed to send out a little salary, and Turkoglu was kind of like the only one San Antonio was really interested in acquiring. Turkoglu also a free agent after this season, so there was a huge chance the team really wasn't keeping him around. I mean, Peja Stojaković was really blocking his role or his path to a starting spot in the lineup. This, though, is a win for the Kings. Brad Miller comes in. He's an all-star in that first season at Arco Arena. Really is the ideal replacement for Vlade Divac. Does a lot of the things Divac did well, and maybe a little more athleticism to his game, a little more talent to Brad Miller's game by this point in time. I mean, Divac doesn't show up to Sacramento until he's in his 30s. Brad Miller was in his prime when he gets to town. Let's also not forget Pollard's role in all of this. Look, I know Scott Pollard, a huge cult hero in the city of Sacramento. He was also on a contract that was not befitting of a backup center who didn't play a lot the year before because he was injured. I mean, Pollard signed like a 5-year, $30 million deal. He was midway through that. So by trading Scott Pollard, the Kings also got out from under that contract. It did cost him Hedo Turkoglu, who went on to have a pretty good career, but getting Brad Miller, for those two, I think it was a slam dunk decision. This trade, Jason Williams and Nick Anderson for Mike Bibby, it stung. Even today, my 12, 13-year-old still feels hard done by the fact the Sacramento Kings traded away Jason Williams, the point guard, the man who pretty much made our team relevant in the late 90s. Jason Williams, total badass. He made the Sacramento Kings cool. He also had severe limitations. He was error prone, questionable decision making, wasn't all of that good defensively. Meanwhile, Sacramento it didn't need a playmaker. They had a lot of playmaking talent. What the team needed at this juncture was a point guard. And by that, I mean they needed a leader, someone who was level-headed, someone who was clutch. They needed a floor general, and Mike Bibby was that and then some. Perhaps more importantly, though, the Kings needed someone who could convince Chris Webber to sign a long-term deal with the franchise. He was a free agent. There was always that rumbling like, oh, he could leave. And by trading for Mike Bibby, it really showed that Sacramento and the front office was serious about winning and committed to him. Jason Williams wasn't that guy, and the results proved this to be the truth over time. Even then, though, White Chocolate was just the coolest man, and I think there were many people around my age who grew up and just got hooked on Kings basketball because of Jason Williams, and this trade will always sort of rub them the wrong way. Mitch Richmond and Otis Thorpe for Chris Webber. What a trade. What a franchise-altering deal for Sacramento. Richmond, for his part, criminally underrated, a consummate professional. Even when he demanded to be traded out of Sacramento, he'd wanted a contract extension, none was forthcoming. He was like, I want to be traded. He did so with the utmost class. Like, this was a guy who knew how to carry himself. The thing was, Rock's in his 30s and on a decline by this point in his career. Chris Webber, also an all-star, mid-20s, but just a total pain in the ass for people to deal with. Even then, though, it's a no-brainer swap for the Kings. Well, maybe not. I would argue that Kings general manager Jeff Petrie doesn't make this deal had he not sort of been in the last chance saloon. I mean, if that Kings team doesn't win that season under his stewardship, he's probably getting fired, and that really gave him license to make what was seen by some in Sacramento as a risky decision with this transaction. Hell, no one really knew if Webber would show up to Sacramento. I mean, it was that risky, but of course he did, and the rest is history. Walt Williams and Tyrone Corbin for Kevin Gamble and Billy Owens. Look, I know what some of you are saying. Oh, Walt Williams, he's no star, but in Sacramento at this time, he was as close as we could get to a star. In fairness, Williams is a very solid role player, one that was just outstretched in Sacramento with this role he had. Like, he wasn't designed to be like the go-to guy the Kings needed him to be. As for this deal, it actually saw the Kings reacquire Billy Owens, who they had traded a few seasons prior after he didn't want to sign a contract with the team, but we'll get to that. Bud Webb may not have won a lot of games in Sacramento, but you know, he did have the best years of his career here, and he was shipped back to Atlanta, where he had actually come from, for Tyrone Corbin. Corbin, for his part, just on his grand tour of the NBA. This kind of just ends up as one of those nothing trades you don't really think about. In fact, the Hawks would trade Webb the following season, and the Kings traded Corbin the following season. Yet, somehow, someway, Corbin would actually play for both the Hawks and Kings again before retiring. This was a franchise-altering trade, more so for the Golden State Warriors than the Sacramento Kings. Billy Owens, with the rights to Billy Owens, was shipped over to Oakland for Mitch Richmond and a bunch of other stuff. So here's what leads to this trade. The Kings draft Billy Owens, the Syracuse forward, with the 3rd overall pick, and honestly, he doesn't really want to come to town. Contract negotiations between the player and team drag on, and let's be real, Sacramento had built a reputation as a place players did not want to end up in, and I think that kind of is why Owens just was reluctant to sign anything with Sacramento. The Kings, just needing a player under contract that they could tell to show up, decided, you know what, we're going to send him over to Golden State despite his promise, despite what he could be. And they got Mitch Richmond and some other stuff in return. Richmond, a very good player, but probably not seen as someone with the upside of Owens, although that would turn out to be a bit of a joke in hindsight. Rock, who was a key part of the Run TMC crew, has gone on to call a trade one of the worst days of his life. That would be until the following day when his former team beat his new team by 62 points. Oof. Then you have Owens, and as we've already gone over, despite not wanting to play in Sacramento, well, down the line he ends up there anyway. Danny Ainge, a winning player, a guy with a pedigree, shows up to Sacramento as someone who can change the culture, doesn't do it, and is then shipped out a little bit later, and the Kings actually got a first-round draft pick for him. He would actually go on now Portland finish with the best record in the NBA in that 90-91 season, meaning the first-round pick the Kings did receive was the very last one in the first round, and then they just pissed it away on Pete Chilcutt anyway. Of course, Ainge just didn't fit into Sacramento's long, aimless rebuild anyway, so I guess it's good they got something for him. Kenny Smith to the Hawks for Antoine Carr and nothing. You know, we've gone over a lot of dumb trades here, but this is one of the dumbest, if not the dumbest trade we will talk about today. Smith, the Jet, a flawed player, but one with upside. You know, just a young point guard the team could, maybe build something around. Antoine Carr, a 28-year-old big who had spent most of his career primarily coming off the bench. And I guess Cedric Toney was there, literally just a bench body. Shortly after the deal was commenced, Kings head of player personnel, Jerry Reynolds, went on to say it was a decision made or influenced quite a bit by the NBA draft. The Kings had 4 draft picks, and those running the team felt the upcoming draft class was a lot stronger, a lot deeper at guard than forward or center. Who does Sacramento end up taking with their 4 first-round draft picks? 2 forwards, a center, and a guard. You cannot make this stuff up. Rory Sparrow ends up as the Kings starting point guard the following season. Of course, that's because Ainge was also shipped out during the offseason. Super honesty time. I know Jerry Reynolds is this beloved figure in Sacramento. Everyone thinks he's a great guy, but quite frankly, he was a terrible basketball mind, and you can trace back a lot of the Kings' struggles in the 80s and 90s to him. He was allowed to loiter around the franchise for this long period of time, despite seemingly having no clue what he was ever doing. You can make excuses for him, you can say it's not his fault, but there's a common denominator with the Sacramento Kings of the late 80s and early 90s, and it's Jerry freaking Reynolds. And I know, again, as I said, people like him, he's an affable guy, whatever. I just don't understand why he was allowed to hang around the organization. He was literally made a color commentator. He's been a lifelong Sacramento King, and he's just not good at what he does. And we need to come out and say this. I think it's a fair discussion to have. Why is Jerry Reynolds revered when he was so bad and he did so much damage to the Sacramento Kings? And I am sorry, but I am not sorry for saying that. Otis Thorpe was still a relatively young player when he was shipped to Houston for Rodney McRae and Jim Peterson. Thorpe was never the most exciting player in the world, but he was a really steady big who could contribute and do what you needed him to do. He wasn't going to be an MVP candidate, but honestly, the Kings just needed competent dudes who could play. You could also make a strong case he was the best thing the Kings had at the time. Rodney McRae was one of the NBA's best wing defenders at the time. He was someone who did play hard. I think the hope the Kings organization had is that he could come in and maybe bring some intangibles to the revolving door of players that were coming and going with the team at this time. It was no secret, Sacramento was the laziest, most loserist basketball team there was, and McRae ended up having very little impact on changing this. Thorpe, though, as we've already mentioned, would find his way back to Sacramento, where he would be traded again a decade later. Sacramento does pretty well getting Randy Whitman in a first rounder for Reggie Theus. For whatever reason, Bill Russell really did not like Reggie Theus. And when Russell was reassigned to become the team's general manager after a disastrous stint as coach, one of the only things he managed to do was trade away Theus. Look, I don't know why Russell didn't rate him, but he did not rate him. The return, though, yielded a first-round pick from Atlanta, which wasn't bad considering Theus had just turned 30. The team would select Ricky Berry with the 18th selection, and he had a promising rookie campaign before tragically passing away. Finally, we have Eddie Johnson, one of the OGs from Kansas City who stuck around in Sacramento for a few years. He would eventually leave town in a swap with Phoenix that saw the Kings net Ed Pinckney. So around this time with Sacramento, Johnson is morphing into a bench gunner type role. Then for reasons, they just trade him to Phoenix for Pinckney. I mean, Pinckney's a little younger, I guess that's why, but the Kings had no idea what to do with him. Like, he had zero role that first season with the team. Then in his second season, Pinckney's starting to find a rhythm. He's in the starting lineup. It looks like, okay, he's starting to realize his potential, and then the Kings trade him again. Meanwhile, Eddie Johnson goes on to win Sixth Man of the Year and just becomes one of the better bench scorers in basketball history. When you look back at all of these trades the Sacramento Kings made involving their own star players, a few things become evident. Firstly, the only time they actually work out is when the Kings are getting a known commodity, a star player, back in return. Even if the star was disgruntled or threatened not to report, it was better than all of the other options. I mean, Chris Webber, Metta Sandiford-Artest, Mike Bibby, Brad Miller, Mitch Richmond, these were deals that worked for the Kings. On the other hand, deals that did not work out for the Kings are ones that involved the franchise receiving draft picks of prospects. Like, Sacramento botches things when this happens, almost famously so. The return on DeMarcus Cousins, Kevin Martin, Chris Webber, Mike Bibby, and Kenny Smith was a combined zero, a goose egg. Sacramento had nothing to show because they don't know how to draft players and they don't know how to scout and identify talent playing for other teams. The jury is still out on the Tyrese Haliburton deal, but considering the Pacers have reached the Eastern Conference Finals, while the Kings haven't won a single playoff series and are now actively shopping De'Aaron Fox, well, it's not looking too good. Speaking of De'Aaron Fox, if Sacramento decides they must trade him, they sure as hell better make sure they get a star player, a bona fide quality NBA-er in return. Because history shows they will waste any draft picks, fail to develop any prospects, or turn around and trade any veterans. Sacramento, they don't call it basketball hell for nothing. Thank you, though, for watching this video. If you'd like to learn more about how the Kings managed to turn things around and create the greatest show on court, well, you can check out the video in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, or for more on Bill Russell's disastrous time in Sacramento, video lower left-hand corner. Until next time, I am Shine Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.